Okay, welcome to the 83rd episode of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm excited to be speaking to Michael Davitt. Michael is an author focusing on mental health issues. He has published 5 books to date under his author pseudonym, Luke Pemberton. His books are based around a series of his drawings illustrating how he experienced and then recovered from complex PTSD stemming from emotional neglect in childhood. Prior to writing these books, Michael worked in the diplomatic field after several years in the private sector. He is from Porthcawl in South Wales and is now based in Vienna, Austria. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Piers. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So, how I'd love to begin the podcast is how I begin most of my podcasts, is just you sharing a bit of your journey. How did you get into writing into the what you do now?
I think it's more, I had really no choice, Piers, to be frank. But perhaps touch on boarding school stuff in a minute, but my parents are very nice parents in many ways, but it was very much a childhood of emotional neglect, although financially quite privileged, and had a reasonably kind of normal life in inverted commas until my mid-40s, when I realized sometimes things weren't quite right inside me, and I had a full-on emotional breakdown, depression, burnout, alcoholism, all sorts of things, hit me like a train. And then I just started writing down what was going through my mind, and I started turning these thoughts into drawings. And then I wrote one book, but compiling these drawings into one kind of narrative of my life to date as it was then. And I thought, well, that's good. I've done that, tick that box. Then I thought, oh, there's more stuff to come out. So I wrote a second book on a similar basis, lots of drawings. And then I did a third one, and then a fourth one, and then a fifth one. It just shows how much there was within me that needed to get out. And often drawing is a really good way to express your emotions. And I tried to just basically understand what I was going through and then draw my experiences using analogies, which I found the best way forward. So a long answer to your question was I had really no choice, I think. I just had to get this stuff out of me, out of my head and onto paper somehow, which really helped me.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, fascinating. I can really relate to your journey of drawing. Jung talked about that, the idea that in his book that I know it was more Robert Moore in his book, The Lover Archetype, The Lover Within, talks about when we draw or we use color, that often accesses the pre-verbal part of our brain. And so I found certainly painting, drawing to be very helpful in my own healing. So
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, it's good to hear as well, Piers. I think it's a common thing among humans and among humans in general, to express themselves through art. It's just an instinct that all humans seem to have. But it takes a bit of courage to tap into that source of creativity, your emotional stress, or your emotional pain, to enable you to do that. So I'm delighted to hear that you also have a kind of a similar experience of it all.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I'd love you to share a little bit more about the emotional neglect and maybe linking that into boarding school and maybe, just talking a little bit of your journey.
Thank you. I did a speech at a conference last year in Wales, and before I went on, I was going to talk about what it's like to have complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And before I did the presentation, I was thinking, I don't have this quite nailed down yet. So while the other speaker was speaking, I just jotted down a few thoughts in my mind about my feelings in childhood. And if you don't mind, I'll just read out a few of them now. So
Please.
what just came out kind of just literally half an hour before my talk, and then I delivered it kind of raw. So some things I'll just go straight into it. Sacrifice met with no recognition, and a desire to attach met with rejection, a really sense of trauma met with shaming, suffering met with no understanding, and abandonment met with no rescue, fear met with no reassurance, self-hatred met with no compassion and no self-compassion, despair met with no respite, confusion met with no answers, hostility met with no kindness, shaming met with no explanation, scapegoating, just me and no one else, conditional love met with no love at the end, effort met with further shaming, a sense of not existing under relevance met with indifference, a craving to connect met with dismissal, a voiceless voice met with silence, a vulnerability met with ridicule, trust met with betrayal, warmth met with coldness, interest met with disinterest, valuing met with devaluation, and authenticity met with shaming and criticism. So this just came out of my head just literally before I was about to this talk. And I think often when you just kind of have a brain dump on things, when you're up against the clock, as it were, some stuff comes out quite authentically. And I read this actually out to the conference I spoke at in Cardiff. I think people generally liked it because it shows quite a bit of vulnerability. And a lot of people kind of quite connected with some of the emotions I felt. So, you know, as I mentioned, I came from quite a financially privileged background. My father was a company director. My mother was a housewife. And yet there was real emotional deprivation. And I think that's what a lot of men, perhaps with our similar experiences, go through, where they feel they have, certainly those who went to boarding school, they feel they've had it all in a sense, and society tells them you're very lucky, you're very fortunate, your parents spent a lot of money, sacrificed, sending you to schools. But if your early life is also not just is financially privileged but emotionally deprived, that's a real confusing situation to be in. And I mean, emotional deprivation is truly wounding, and it often does occur. Well, it sometimes can occur in financially privileged situations where the father's working all the time, and the mother may be a bit snobbish and a bit distracted, and etc. So those kind of emotions I just read out were kind of my base experience of what I felt in childhood. And of course, we can look at those common themes of abandonment and rejection and hostility, and a sense of just being alone and being emotionally isolated. And just to finish on this point, one of the issues I think was just having nobody to talk to. There was nobody I could actually talk to about my feelings, and nobody I could turn to. My grandparents lived abroad, or lived in one set lived in Ireland. The others I didn't really know, and no uncles or aunts in the area. So I think it's, and then of course you then turn in on yourself, you blame yourself for it all, and so those are my kind of key takeaways, or I think the key experiences or emotions I felt in childhood, which is effectively emotional neglect. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. That's really powerful. What you said, the list that you wrote down last year before this talk, that's really powerful. It's like, yeah, to hear those things is, yeah, it's heartbreaking to think, to see all of them together, and that this is how we are educating our children, and we're saying it's good for you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think society there is a huge problem in that kids need attachment. Fundamentally, they need to feel safe. You evolved as a species, and the first thing you do when you come out of the womb is you have to attach. You have to find somebody. The biological instinct is to find somebody who can care for you, and it's such a powerful drive because it's a drive for survival. And if you don't attach to a being, you know, the fear is overwhelming, and that is unfortunately the case in so many families, even these days. You know, we are such a developed society in so many ways, yet fundamentally we don't do the most basic thing that all living species, or all mammals do, which is attach to your young. And that to me is just bonkers. It's so crazy that if you can't attach to your own child, or if your child, or if the child can't find attachment, it's the most fundamental building block of life, and it shouldn't be that difficult. Yet our society, I think, doesn't support parents properly, and there's so many distractions in life, and so many kids don't get that attachment, and you spend your whole life with a huge emotional hole inside of you, a void, because of that. And then because you can't attach, you then don't feel you can be your authentic self,
Mm.
because your authentic self is obviously in your mind led to rejection. So that then leads to more confusion, more pain to try to be somebody else, just not yourself. And that then adds to the whole complication of it all. Um, and you abandon your authentic self and you try to be somebody else, anybody else, just not you. And it leads to a lifetime of confusion and self-hatred and detachment from your authentic self, and etc. So, so I think society, it's a really, and all that leads to all sorts of problems down the road. As you know yourself, Piers, it leads to, in my life, alcoholism and burnout and depression and relationship problems and divorce and all these, and my career stalling. And it can all, I think, be traced back to the very beginning.
Mm.
And then I think if you throw in boarding school into the mix as well, and I went to a Catholic boarding school, there's got a lot of quite strict religious dogma. Talk to me. I went to a Catholic and then a convent school when I was very young, then another religious school, then a Catholic boarding school. So when you throw all that into the mix as well, it really makes it quite a difficult start in life. But then you think to yourself, well, I'm financially privileged. I'm lucky to have had this education, which makes the whole thing even more confusing. So yeah, I think it's a societal problem in many ways.
Mm. Mm. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. What you said doesn't support, society doesn't support people properly.
Yeah, I
And
think I
parents.
think there's so many distractions in in family life, and so much pressure to succeed and to do well and to earn money. So in that sense, I do also want to be too critical of my own parents. My father worked very hard for his money. He worked, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, 5, 6 days a week. And when he was home, he just wanted to relax and play golf and do nothing. And my mother had a very traumatic childhood herself, growing up in the valleys in South Wales, at least originally from near Birmingham. And so, and of course, even in those days, there just wasn't the awareness of mental health issues.
Mm.
But it's just strange that, any mammal, be it a horse or a whale or whatever, they immediately attach to the young, and yet we, as a kind of advanced inverted commas species, fail that most basic test. And I think, to my mind, that's the crux of it all. I love it. I think maybe we touch on boarding schools later. I think with boarding schools, with the army or anything else, a lot of people who experience trauma in those environments are people who have underlying trauma from childhood.
Mm. Mm.
That's my experience of it. So, I boarding school stuff it was tricky for me, but I just managed to cope with it. But I think if I hadn't had the underlying trauma from childhood, I would have had a more enjoyable time at school. Um, but so I think, yeah, it's a pretty basic thing to get right. And it goes back to things like childcare and giving parents time off work,
Mm.
and also people like me and you, Piers, if we can blow our own trumpets, just talking about it,
Mm.
because a lot of people out there as well, who I know, who are professionally very successful, lawyers and everything, with nice cars, nice flats, and sending their kids to private schools, but who are deep down, who are really, really suffering
Mm.
because they've done what society has demanded of them. They've done what their parents have demanded of them. They got the job, they got the money, they got the status, and yet they're completely floundering. They've
Mm.
married the wrong person for the wrong reasons, and they are in real deep down emotional pain, and they can't, but they can't see a way out, because in their minds they've done everything that society and their parents have demanded of them, and yet they're really floundering.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and this thing of not speaking up. We spoke before we, started recording this, that as men and women, especially if we've been to these institutions, or just full stop, and Nick Duffel says that money doesn't trickle down from the top, even though we're told it does. But he says that beliefs and patterns and behaviors do. So if our leaders aren't speaking up, if those are in positions of power, stiff upper lip, and then that's what society does. In Britain, we have this thing of boys don't cry.
Mm.
And actually, we need to start changing that and saying, no, men do cry. and men do speak up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Piers. And um, I may say something a bit controversial now, but I'm absolutely no fan of Boris Johnson at all. But part of me feels desperately sorry for him
Mm.
because he is this tiny little traumatized little boy who's just floundering, and he's got this double whammy where he feels he should be the king of the world, and yet deep down he is paradoxically, I think deep down he sees himself. I'm no psychologist, but this is how I read it, as the smallest, most insignificant, most shameful little being that is imaginable. So that's why he can't apologize. He can't show accountability because he's internally so fragile that any hint of him apologizing would just crush his own fragile sense of being. So this is where the Britain is such a great country in so many ways, and I'm very proud to be British. But this is one thing that we do not do well: is create is I think going back to him, I think he had quite a traumatic childhood, and some of the stuff he saw his father do, etc. And so it's just a good example of how things can go so desperately wrong, and then that then person is then put in a position of power, and with all the tragic consequences that are then subsequently unfolded. So, yeah, as you say, people in power need to show real moral courage, and unfortunately, we had somebody in his case who wasn't able to, partly because I think he was so wounded early in life, and then coupled with him being pushed in Eton and Oxford to be a leader. And then you're suddenly in this awful quandary where you believe you should be a leader, and yet deep down you feel yourself to be the most insignificant and shamed being that is possible to imagine. So it's a recipe for disaster. And unfortunately, we don't have enough people at the top who do show moral courage. And that comes down to, I guess, just knowing yourself, and confronting your fears, understanding your journey, and knowing about who you are and why you are that person, and then being able to talk about it like we're doing now.
Mm. Thank you, thank you. And I really resonate with that and think we believe we're insignificant, and therefore it's all about us at the end of the day. I've read Tony Blair's, David Cameron's autobiographies, and deep down inside, they've wanted to help others.
Mm.
But if we haven't dealt with the wounding, if we haven't done psychotherapy, or if we haven't explored that, then, as Nick Duffel says in his book Wounded Leaders, that part of us ends up running the show. And that's what I see, is that it's all about me
Mm.
because I'm still the little boy. He's in charge.
Yeah, and I think that the society pushes these people to take pivotal positions in society, and they are willing to go down that road, partly because it inflates their ego, which is what they desperately need. But then suddenly, the emperor suddenly seems to have no clothes. That suddenly, when they really are, when push comes to shove, and of course there was a lot of, um, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of scrutiny on these people, and when the people of that sort of fragile nature are scrutinized, then often they flounder, and part of me does actually feel quite sorry for them.
Mm, thank you. I so agree. I was watching Boris Johnson last week, and I'm almost in tears in the COVID inquiry. It's like he just looked crestfallen.
Mm.
That it's almost like the proof was that he had said these things.
Mm.
He was in a bit of a bluffing when he was in power. Oh, it's fine, but now it's actually it's landing with him, and it's like, oh yeah. Likewise, I just feel really sad and have compassion that he's a yeah for him, and I do feel we need to therefore go. What are the leaders we do want to bring in?
You're right, and I think when I watched that briefly, there he was as a little terrified 5-year-old boy with his father admonishing him. I mean, I think he fell back into that kind of child ego state
Mm,
where, as a child, when you confronted with this very powerful authoritarian figure like his father, and I felt the same with my father, you're utterly helpless. You try to state your case, but if this authority figure is very hostile towards you and demeaning towards you and disrespectful towards you, you have no defense. You can't defend yourself.
Mm.
So you try to wiggle out of it somehow. And I think in that sense, Boris Johnson in that setting was very much like that. He was back to this child ego state with him being told he's a naughty boy, and he should be ashamed of himself. And in front of this lawyer, who I think in many ways probably subconsciously represented his father, and he was back as that very scared little boy again. And it was quite tragic to see him struggle so much. And as you say, he came across as crestfallen and slightly broken and utterly helpless. And there's a lot of good that private schools do in Britain, but if private schools are producing people with that level of emotional fragility, then something is fundamentally very wrong with how we're raising kids.
Mm. Thank you, thank you. I have a podcast going live this Friday. I spoke with a recovering alcoholic who'd been to boarding school, and she was sharing in the episode that she was going around, traveling around the country to different AA meetings because she's an author. And she was saying that in one meeting, she realized that there were 6 people there, 5 of them were ex-boarders. Another one, it was 9 out of, I believe, 10 or 11. It's 0.5% or possibly 0.5% to 1% of the population go to boarding schools. She's saying that, it's like so much of Alcoholics Anonymous addictions seems to be people who've been to boarding school.
Yeah, I mean, and there's this great Canadian psychiatrist and doctor called Gabor Mate, who's written a few books on these topics, and I know really rings a bell when he says addiction like alcohol, it's just a way to numb the pain. It's not a physical thing, it's not a genetic thing, or maybe some cases, but generally speaking, it's a desperate attempt to avoid feeling overwhelming pain. And if you've had a difficult childhood and then lay on top of that boarding school, well, there is, of course, maybe we'll go into this later, but there is, of course, a sense of emotional abandonment, even though subconsciously at the time, I didn't really feel it, but only retrospectively. And there is an emotional hole inside of you, and there's a lot of pain, and it's very confusing, and you don't want to go and revisit it because it's too frightening. And the only way to numb that pain is to either work very hard or drink a lot or do extreme sports or anything to distract you from the pain. And yeah, so that's why people like Boris Johnson, although I in many ways I revile him, I think we should feel some ways kind of sorry for him. And I think childhood pain is very, very difficult to grasp if you haven't experienced it, because it's so deep rooted and it's so overwhelming that people have no choice but to depress it and to push it down. And this is where the term depression comes from, as Gabor Mate is saying. And if to enable you to do that, you've got to keep drinking or keep working hard or keep doing extreme sports. Until at some point, it's like certainly with me happened, it just has to come out. And that's why breakdowns in many ways are kind of a good thing, because it forces you to reset your whole life and your whole mentality and everything, and force you to confront these underlying issues.
Thank you, thank you. I'd love for you to speak a little bit about your boarding school experiences. How was it for you, Michael?
Partly it was kind of normal because, again, I came from quite a financially privileged environment, and a lot of my friends, I went also to a private kind of prep school. They also went to private school, and so all my friends when I grew up all went away to school. So it was just something that you assumed was the normal course of life. So it was never in question really, and therefore when I went, it was just a normal thing. Of course, you just don't question it at the time. And in many ways, I think I'm a fairly open person. So I think I managed to make mixed emotions, basically, to answer your question. There was, looking back now, there was a huge amount of dread going back to school. And the first few months were desperately hard. And it's quite an austere building, like lots of private schools are. But the flip side is you've got no choice but to build quite strong emotional bonds with other boys. And the one good thing that came out of it is I do have, when I do meet up with the old boys from my school, we have a reunion next year, you are on a very there's a close emotional connection there without you really realizing it. Because at the end of the day, that you were all you had. You were your family, and you had to rely on each other. Unfortunately, though, there are people out there who were picked on and who were bullied for no reason other than to being slightly different. And this is where the real trauma comes in. The people who are bullied at these schools have nowhere to go, nowhere to escape. And these schools can utterly destroy lives.
Mm.
And if you're not, reasonably funny or open or friendly, I always try to be overtly friendly and a bit of a people pleaser. I think that can help me survive a bit. And I was reasonably good at sports. So, but to be honest, and the whole Catholic thing didn't help either. So I'm a bit of a ramble here, but it's kind of a mixed experience. But it's something, that's why I'm glad to come on this podcast, because it's something I think I've kind of repressed a bit too much. I haven't really explored it as much as I should have done, because there is a kind of underlying sense of abandonment, which I hadn't really appreciated, only because everybody else was being abandoned anyway. So you're with my friend from my hometown, went away to school, and everybody I was with at school, of course, it was in boarding school. So there's kind of communal sense of abandonment, which I've only just really started to explore.
Communal sense of abandonment. Thank you. Yeah, I can really resonate with that. I mean, my way at school of surviving was to not have friends. I was good at sport, but it was like just didn't trust people. It was like, no, I'm just gonna not even talk. Do sport, do the academic side. But I struggled with the academics because I was in so much fear. My brain went to freeze. And there's research now which shows that, if you're in that state of fear that so many of us were, the brain doesn't work as well because it needs to be relaxed. Your energy goes into the extremities when you're in fight, flight, or, fear. But yeah, I can really resonate with that. And what you're saying about abandonment and neglect, I mean, research, I often bring this up in the podcast, is research is now showing that emotional neglect or physical neglect is even more damaging than acute abuse.
Yeah. And of course, exactly, absolutely, which is the crux of the whole matter. And I think in these schools, especially if you have a difficult childhood, as I mentioned, it just kind of exacerbates everything at a subconscious level that you've gone through in childhood. Because just when you're going through puberty, you really need, because I've got two kids of my own, and you realize how 18 and nearly 15, and you realize how much emotional support they really do need, especially going through puberty. And it's such a fragile time. And yet at that critical time in life, I know the only people I had to speak to was the monk, my housemaster, who was, wasn't the best talker, and all you other boys. So it is a very profound sense of looking back and have emotional abandonment, which just felt normal at the time, which is so abnormal, and I probably use the word toxic there. It's just you realize that all the normal stages of emotional development you should go through of healthy development, of attaching when you're young, of being able to be your authentic self, of being accepted, of feeling safe in emotional relationships, of being able to be yourself, of being able to express who you are. If they don't happen in childhood, then they're definitely going to happen in a private boarding school environment. So you effectively miss out on so many key stages of emotional development. It's crazy how many of us actually survive later life. And then there is a pressure later in life to do well professionally because you've had, in inverted commas, a very privileged upbringing. And that's when you get into the Boris Johnson territory. So I think if you have a very healthy emotional upbringing in childhood, where you have secure attachments, you can be who you are, you can be your authentic self, and you go back to a warm, loving family during half term and school holidays, I think there are people who do kind of thrive in that environment, and in that sense, private schools can be good for some people. But if you don't have that bedrock of early compassion, understanding, and just feeling safe in a relationship, then I think boarding school, it just adds to the trauma of it all and exacerbates the problems, which only kind of manifest themselves later in life.
Thank you. Yeah, in my research and clientele, I find it's about 10% who seem to do okay in boarding school. But even those 10% still have to survive. They find their mechanism for surviving. Interestingly, you mentioning about if we had good upbringings, some fascinating. I'll send you the paper afterwards from Ann Power, who's a psychotherapist who wrote a paper on boarding school and attachment theory, um, saying that if we were emotionally securely attached as children and then we're sent to boarding school, often that can be even worse for us because we're
Mm.
more likely to show emotions. We haven't learned to
Ah,
dissociate, and
interesting.
therefore we're more likely to be bullied.
Mm.
And we also have that sense of we're not good enough. Why on earth have they, if they loved me, why on earth have they sent me away? And that confusion. So yeah, I just find it all so fascinating.
That's interesting, Piers. Thank you for that. I guess in my case, I didn't really, I had very low self-esteem going away to private school, and I didn't, because I never really had a strong, any sense of emotional attachment, I never really felt emotionally safe with either parent. In many ways, I really like that point. Thank you again. Paradoxically, that made it easier for me
Mm,
because I wasn't used to attaching emotionally to people, and I wasn't perhaps as homesick as others were because I didn't never really felt at home, as it were.
mm,
So that's a really interesting angle, and yeah, I'd love to read more about that. It's kind of
Awesome.
paradoxical, isn't it, in the sense that that shows what damage boarding schools can do. Then they take emotionally reasonably healthy people and they actually turn them into emotionally kind of unhealthy people. And actually touching on that, rugby, of course, is quite big in my boarding school, as is in many boarding schools.
Mine too. That was one of my big
Yeah.
sports.
Okay, well, I think people good at sport work. It's a way to survive in these environments.
Mm,
And the captain of my first 15 school, I was in the second under five,
mm,
um, was actually he was really looked up to, and in school, as you can probably appreciate. And if you were in the first 15 school, you got to wear a special cricket jumper during the day and with the colours of school, etc. So you really looked up to. But I think he's never come to any subsequent reunion because I think that was his high point in many ways. I think he and I spoke to his brother, his younger brother, and he says he's reluctant to come to any reunion because I think maybe subconsciously he feels, he was really looked up to and regarded as a kind of a heroic figure in school. And maybe he feels he hasn't really met those levels of attainment since. So even the people who kind of thrive in school, certainly from a sporting perspective, they're a big fish in a very small pond and they feel like the king of the castle. But as soon as they get out of school, they can sometimes be a bit reluctant to meet up with former their schoolmates because they feel they've kind of failed in the bigger picture of life. Because
mm,
it's an impossible thing of course, to attain. You can't. It's very few people who achieve really well at school and really, really well in life subsequently.
mm,
So yeah, I think it's a pretty damning picture overall.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard that story quite a lot of people from my school who were head boy or head girl, struggling afterwards because it was the pinnacle. You were seen as the person, and then, I mean, I've mentioned this, I think, last week in the podcast. My belief deep down, although I was very good at rugby, I was in the first 15, and was I'm a piece of shit. That was
Mm.
how I survived that complex PTSD that Pete Walker talks about, that horrible inner critic. That's what was running the show. And
Yeah,
you can only do it for so long. That's why I see so many people who go into city or the profession, lawyer, get to 40s, 50s, and then suddenly they have a breakdown because that the piece of shit dialogues doesn't work. You just give up.
Yeah, and I think I think this all comes back to things like I'm not sure what your child was like, Piers, but to do with me, it all come back to childhood. It comes back to a sense of just not feeling safe, emotionally speaking, in childhood, and not feeling attached. And that is very, very frightening, because if you don't feel attached to any caregiver, I generally believe that my mother, if I didn't toe the line, she would drive me off to a hill and leave me there, in the middle of the rain. And that was a genuine fear of mine. And yeah, and then as a child, certainly very, very young, when neither parent is willing to engage or attach with you, or share any affection or compassion or love, it is too overwhelming to believe or to admit to yourself, these people can't care for me. They can't do it. And that's too overwhelming. These people are maybe not malicious or cruel, but they are certainly come across that way, and I'm in danger. And the only way you can kind of, work that out in your mind to come to terms with that is to blame yourself. So you say, well, I must be the problem. I'm the one. I'm unlovable. I'm a piece of shit.
Mhm.
I'm not worthy of their attention. They got much more important things to do. I'm to blame. And that's where this awful self-criticism voice of Torquemada, or the Spanish Inquisition, it comes at you.
Mhm.
Because you have no choice as a child but to blame yourself, because the alternative explanation is just too distressing.
Mhm.
So when that happens, then you're in a real bind, because you've got nobody to talk to. You keep blaming yourself. You repress all your anger, which is the other thing. Repressing your anger is so unhealthy. And then you turn that anger in on yourself. And then there's this vicious spiral develops, where you just keep blaming yourself. You keep hating yourself more. And then you look around. I looked around, a lot of my friends and their parents, they seemed to be getting on well with their parents. I was the only one who didn't. And my mother kind of doted on my younger brother, and kind of was quite very hostile towards me, the middle child. And you think, well, I just don't get it. Everybody else can connect with their parents. I can't. I just don't get it. And then that exacerbates and furthers a sense of stupidity, and I'm a piece of shit, and blah blah blah, because um, it's just a downward spiral. And um, yeah, and then it's a pretty difficult hole to get out of. And then you repress that, and then you repress it even more in private school. And then a lot of these guys who say go into the army or the city or become lawyers, but fundamentally, deep down, certainly for me, speaking for myself, there's this still of this it's this part, there's still a very small sense of me who is such a tiny, 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 tiny little figure that's so meek and scared and powerless, and that's still a part of me. And you've just got to go to those areas of real fragility and pain and insecurity, and you just got to try to understand it. Because if you without digging that deep, it's doubtful you'll ever really come to terms with it all.
Thank you. Yes, so agree. Meeting that tiny figure, that scared, powerless figure. So I'd love you to segue a little bit into, if you feel comfortable, sharing a bit of your breakdown. How did that come to a culmination, the breakdown, breakthrough?
So I was living in Vienna at the time, married, two kids, was working in the kind of diplomatic field, which is I really enjoyed the work, very interesting. Um, and for a while, I just felt really, really, really exhausted, and I
Mhm.
just couldn't work out what it was. And I was drinking quite a lot. And one day, literally, all the thoughts just fell out of my head. I literally felt like my whole brain had just collapsed in on it. Just everything in my mind, all my thoughts had just literally fallen out onto the ground around me. And I thought, this is not good. So luckily I went on the balcony. I kind of and snapped back a bit into what's going on there. And next day I went to a doctor, went to a psychiatrist, and then I was diagnosed with well, it was effectively a breakdown, but it was kind of brewing for an awfully long time. But that was a very scary experience. And then I was off work for about 9 months, and for the following 9 months, I could hardly get out of bed. I just even making a piece of toast was just an enormous burden. Um, and I do write a bit about it in the books about what it really feels like your head's in a vice and it's being squeezed, and all sorts of other analogies. But it was really frightening experience, and it took me about 9 months of just doing nothing to kind of recover. And then I went back to work. Then that didn't work out. And then a further kind of mini breakdown. Then I took time off work. I went to like a pretty much an alcoholic clinic for 5 weeks, and that gave me a proper break from life. And that's what you need. You need to just get away from everything, your family, your work, the pub. You need to get away. And I had 5 weeks away, which has really, really saved me. And that then, but the breakdown forces you to take what you're going through seriously. So I went to see a good psychiatrist, and I went back to my therapist, and I just started writing my books, and you get out of that hole. But it was a really frightening experience. But often they'd say it's the only your body is telling you, if you don't deal with these issues, I'm going to break you. And in many ways, it's a self-protection mechanism. And in that sense, it's a very, in inverted commas, healthy thing to go through, although I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But often it's the only way to do it, because, yeah, so that's kind of it in a nutshell. But it'd been brewing for a long time, and I kind of felt it, and I kind of tried to keep it at bay as long as possible. But then your body just says no, and it just breaks you. But the emotional exhaustion that comes from it, and the fatigue you feel, is really difficult to describe. Just going back to that, prolonging the point, just going back to what we said before about this emotional, the kind of the self-hatred, that is a very, very tiring thing to have to carry through life.
Mm.
Because part of you says, no, I want to like myself, I'm a good person, but the half of you just wants to destroy yourself. So you're living in a sense of permanent conflict, and it's just like you're in a boxing match with yourself, and it's just exhausting. And when you throw into that, professional life, kids, family, the pressures of relationships, etc. I know it was I had to break down when I was 45. It's 45 years in the making, and it just slowly builds and builds and builds and builds. The self-hatred, and a lot of it is just internal self-hatred and sense of shame, feeling like a piece of shit, and not being able to survive, and not being able to love yourself. And after a while, it just breaks you.
Mm. Thank you. Thank you for your honesty and sharing. It sounds like it was a really tough and challenging journey.
Yeah, and but again, that's why it's so great talking to people like yourself, Piers, because at the end of the day, I think we're all, despite all the outward signs of many people, especially people like us, who've gone through similar experiences, that a lot of people are really, really floundering out there, really
Mm-hmm.
having really, really difficult lives. On the surface, not, but dig down a little deeper, and they really are. And I know, certainly in the past, a breakdown was seen as a weakness, but it's a real sign of health. It really is. It's your body just trying to save you, and your mind trying to save you. So I think we should move to a place where we see breakdowns as a sign of, in many ways, courage, in a sense, and that or courage, or some kind of self-help mechanism where your body kicks in to save you. And I think we should be very grateful for these experiences. And I think a lot of people would back that up. And I think the more we remove the stigma from a breakdown, the more it can be seen as a kind of return to health more than anything else. It's seen as kind of return to darkness, but in fact, it's actually return to health.
Thank you. Yeah, I so agree. I think my journey was similar, my breakdown. I mean, mine was over a number of years. 2000, I started to think I was going insane, working in London, voices, talking, and obviously I learnt, as you shared, not to talk.
Mm.
And therefore I didn't share that violent thoughts, and it was like really quite worrying. And then, like I said, I was homeless for a number of months. And then I went to see a doctor. I think and I was sharing my story with him. He laughed at me when I shared my story. He was looking at his watch, and he's just like, oh, I don't have time for this. And oh my God, the first time I'd ever talked to anyone.
I mean, I
And
suppose. that's appalling. I mean,
Yeah, I
okay,
still have the letter somewhere. And for me, you know, spiraled really because there was no one to talk to. I hadn't built up that network. And I think as men, we don't do that. Now it's great. We've got places like Andy Man Club, the Mankind Project, which I'm a part of. I've interviewed on my podcast many of the men from the UK, and you know the founder of the Mankind Project, which is rites of passage. It's a charity that they do lots of different charity work across the world, working with incarcerated youths in prisons, and it's just yeah, it's great that those environments around there. But I think what you're talking about and what I went through is that a lot of men nowadays don't have that network to just go, I'm really struggling today.
yeah,
Just want to
yeah.
cry.
I mean, I think it all comes back to one key emotion, I think, which is shame.
Mm, mm,
And a lot of men feel deep shame about who they are, and it's from my experience, it is remarkable how far one's self-esteem can fall. I
mm.
mean, it's almost bottomless, and the picture you can create of yourself, it's so detrimental, and it's so unhealthy, and it's so toxic, and it's so poisonous, and it's so it's terrifying how far my self-esteem really did fall. I mean, and we go back to this sense of seeing yourself as a piece of excrement. I mean, that's how I saw myself, and it's awful to admit that to yourself. It really is. It's really, really painful and so sad. And yet, when you do stop, when people like us do talk peers, you realize, oh my God, other people also regard themselves in such a tragically dreadful, awful, almost unthinkable light. And I think that's where we can kind of help others, I think, hopefully, is by admitting that it's almost beyond belief how far one's self-esteem can truly fall. Um, and that is a very, very lonely place to be. It really is. And
Mhm.
the further it falls, the less likely you are to talk about it,
Yeah.
and becomes a vicious cycle. The more you feel ashamed of who you are, the more you feel, well, it's my fault, I'm not good enough, it's my fault, I feel ashamed. And then the shame spirals out of control. And then you become even more silent, and you become more reluctant to talk to anybody else. And
Mm.
it takes an awful lot of courage and energy and time to snap out of that spiral. But one way to do that is just to admit it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I've heard this a lot recently. I for the documentary I'm making about boarding school, I managed to speak to Gabor Mate,
Oh,
and when I first spoke to him, he said, you know, boarding school wasn't the trauma, and I'm like, huh? He says, no. Who did you have to speak to there? And I said, well, no one. And he says, that's the trauma. You've got no one to talk to. And I think as teenagers and also as men and women, we need to have someone that we can just talk to, not try and fix. But like you said, the emotional um, intelligence you've given your children just because you realize that's what they needed, just you being there.
mm,
That's what I see we don't get in these institutions, even nowadays. Parents are still not there.
mm,
WhatsApp is still not the same. And I really see that that's the that's the trauma, is we've got no one to talk to. And I think part of the healing is that we can talk now.
yeah. And I think, but it is difficult to open up about it because the self-hatred, it becomes so visceral
Mm,
that it's a really frightening thing to admit to somebody else. And you also mentioned the violent thoughts. I've also had a load of those because there's so much pent-up repressed rage and anger
mm,
that can only come out in kind of violent images in your mind. So I totally get all that. Um, a lot of it is actually what's sad. Have a quick sip of what's really sad and also quite revealing is my father had a very traumatic childhood growing up in Dublin in Ireland, Catholicism and distant parents, blah blah. But he was very hostile towards me,
mm.
and my mother also very hostile. And that's of course where I think, again, going back to that Laban point, that's where a lot of the damage is done in early childhood. But I still find myself trying to, even now, when he's 87 with dementia, trying to get his approval. It's just so ridiculous. The urge inside me, my inner child, still trying to get his approval is just the drive, the desire to do that is so powerful still. And so a lot of it is it's growing up without a father who you can feel safe with, and a mother who you can feel safe with. And that then creates all sorts of problems down the line in terms of relations and things. But a lot of it, I think, what all boys need to have an attachment with the father. It's just so obvious, and that's what so many of us lack. That can be made up a bit if you have a good relationship with your mother, but if you don't on either front, and have no grandparents or uncles or aunts nearby, and then you're a 5-year-old boy and you've got nobody to talk to, that is as we said before, it's a really difficult place. And it's the lack of an authority figure who can make you feel safe when you're young is I think is a key to it all.
Thank you, Michael. So I'd love for you to just to segue a bit into the path of healing. How do we start to execute a new life based on knowledge and wisdom gained from this journey? How do we heal from complex PTSD?
I got like a little process to go through. The first thing, of course, is finding a therapist. So the first 2 therapists I went to, I just didn't see it. I said to myself, I don't really quite get this. Well, seeing a therapist takes a lot of courage. The first time I knocked on the door of a therapist, I thought to myself, what the hell am I doing? I'm a grown man. I don't need to speak to some woman or man about my problems. But that's the first step. It takes a lot of courage. Then the first 2 I saw, I just didn't quite get it. I thought, okay, let's go, let's try once more. Third one I tried, I just clicked. I just felt so comfortable with him. And I've been seeing him now on and off for many years, still see him regularly. That's the most important thing. You just got to start talking to somebody, but fundamentally talking to somebody who you click with. And I'm not quite sure how I define click, but that's the best way to do it. And then what I still do is after each therapy session, I write down notes of what we discussed. And during the week or the 2 weeks between sessions, any dream I've had, any sense of suffering I felt, any real strong emotion, shame, whatever it may be, I write it down. And then I use those in my next session. And then after a while, you build up these kind of notes of who you are and your background with the therapist. And then I started turning those into really basic stick figure drawings. And they're so easy to do. It's just a smiley face, despair with the frown and stick figures, and it's really simple. I got a book on it. But all that, then you just got to do a lot of work on yourself. A lot of it is just introspection. You've got to go to difficult places in your mind, and you got to feel it. You got to feel that sense. I'm a piece of excrement. You're going to say, right, I got to go there, and I've got to feel what it really feels like. I've got to admit to myself. You got to feel that tiny little boy inside me that's really scared. You've just got to go there, and you just got to acknowledge that feeling, and you just got to examine it and understand it and talk about it and tease it out. And in that sense, it's a kind of straightforward process, but it's also inherently complex because you're trying to untangle all these experiences that you had 45 years ago, because mine always goes back to childhood. So it takes a lot of, it's almost like being an archaeologist or almost like Indiana Jones type person. You got to go all the way back to your deep past and be brave and face all those demons that you face at the time and that you've repressed since. So in summary, I'd say, you've got to talk about it, find a good therapist who you click with, and you write down what you're experiencing in and out of the sessions, draw stuff if you can. But a lot of it is just introspection. It's going for long walks or waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, okay, what am I really scared of? What scares me? Who scares me and why? And you just got to keep exploring it all.
Love that. It's nice and simple. Finding a therapist, talking with someone, writing down in between sessions any dreams, strong emotions, and then final one is introspection. Go for long walks. If you wake in the night, what's this about? Exploring the inner world.
Exactly. Even small things, because like a long time ago, I'd often see kind of like an alpha male, a guy with a great body and flash watch and smart suit and everything. And I would generally feel very insecure around them. And that's a topic, for example, you can explore. Okay, well, where does that sense of insecurity come from? And that's just one minor example of many, many, where these senses of insecurity and weakness, whatever you may see, or just basic insecurity, I guess, is your mind telling you you need to look at this. So
Mm.
rather than bury these sense of these feelings of insecurity and anxiety around certain types of people, be it a police officer or be it an alpha male or whatever it may be, it's your mind telling you this is an issue you've got to look into. So I think
Mm.
you've got to, any fears or anxieties you have, or talking in front of people. Okay, well, yeah, I'm fear doing a presentation tomorrow. Fine. Well, where does that fear come from? And you've got to dig down to a very deep level of, a fear of shame, of exposing your sense of excrement to others, and all this all subconscious stuff. But you just got to. So when any fear you come across is actually a bridge to, I use the word enlightenment, but
Mm.
these are indications. These are signs your body's telling you, your mind's telling you, you've got to look into this. So these are really positive cues that you can learn from rather than trying to repress further.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, that's really useful to hear going into those places that scare us. And I think what I see is I sometimes work with people who come and say, well, I used to be able to handle this. And what I try and say to them is, yeah, if you dissociate, you squash down to the basement and you keep doing that,
Mm.
that's not a good, it might work for a few years, but eventually the basement's full. You've got to go back in there and actually feel, what have I hidden down there?
Mm.
What have I put, as Robert Bly talks about, in my shadow bag? Because it doesn't stay anger in the shadow bag, it morphs into rage, we've got to really feel these things and channel these things and keep doing it.
Absolutely, Piers. And just to add to that, one thing I found is you go down to find kind of like, it's kind of a weird now, but you go to find you identify what you're really scared of, and you kind of examine it a bit with a therapist and introspection and everything. And
Mm.
what I kind of found was you kind of find little abandoned parts of yourself that
Mm.
you kind
Mm.
of like abandoned years ago. So I had
Mm.
this analogy of me almost finding a little cave inside of me, and there's like a dungeon, and open up the door, and inside there's a little small version of me as a small boy, and this boy's
Mm.
been in there for so many years, alone and abandoned and forgotten about, and he's smashed up the place, he's drawn graffiti on the wall out of rage, but he's been locked in there for so long, and then I kind of feel myself unlocking that door and letting him out, and it's a wonderful feeling of kind of reintegrating yourself with these abandoned parts of yourself, because
Mm.
when you are go through shame in childhood, you do try to be anybody but yourself, and that does lead you to abandoning, your authentic self in childhood, and those bits of you kind of cut off and you deposit somewhere, and they do remain inside of you. They really do. They don't go away, and then
Mm.
you need
Mm.
to overcome, and they create an awful lot of psychological problems subconsciously that just have to come up later in life. And
Mm.
until you go back and find those sources of pain and those abandoned parts of yourself, you're always going to have issues, I think.
Mm. Thank you. It reminds me of the work of IFS, internal family systems, and a system that I've been creating over the last few years called the inner kingdom, which is as boys, girls at school, boarding school, or if we didn't have benevolent parents, we didn't have good role models. For us, for me, at boarding school, it was just boys and girls around me, and therefore I didn't learn how to be a man.
Mm.
And therefore, what I've found with clients is we've got to create an inner kingdom with these different parts. And outside the wall or in the dungeons are where these parts of us that we had to split off in order to survive, the tearful part, the angry part, the sensitive part, the sensual part, all of these parts. And we've got to bring them back and bring them back online. And it takes negotiating, it takes an inner ego structure to go, hey, you're upset. I remember doing that on work one time after the monastery in I went to monastery from 2002 to 2005 as part of my falling apart. When I went back to the corporate world, one day I was quite upset, and I just said to my inner child, I said, "It's all right. We'll go and paint," because I had a studio nearby at 6 o'clock. Just hold this. And I calmed down then.
Mm.
And then at 6 o'clock, I had to honor it, and I went and did my painting and that. And then I felt so much better. So it's like managing that kingdom.
I think it's a really good analogy. I really like that. I think a lot of it also is yeah, you come across, yeah, here's a good point there, which is I think confronting all the stuff as a grown man is challenging enough. But then what I find difficult is then you've got to actually get we all have this inner child inside of us, as you know, that never really goes away. And not only do you have to confront the stuff as an adult, but you've also got to get your inner child to confront this stuff. And so I can confront the fact that I had a very distant relationship with my mother and my father, and that can be explained to some extent. But you've also got to go back and ask your inner child to understand that as well. And it's quite difficult to explain to a 6-year-old inner child, your parents weren't there for you. Well, for whatever reason, they couldn't be there for you. And it was unsafe. The emotional environment was very unsafe for a 6-year-old boy. And it's quite sad telling your inner child that, but your inner child also has to accept these very uncomfortable, unpalatable truths. Because otherwise your adult self will accept this stuff, acknowledge it. But if your inner child is still resistant to it, saying, no, my mummy and daddy still love me, they all did, blah, blah, you're not quite fully healed, if that's the right word. So you've got to deal with it as an adult, but then you also got your inner child to confront all those really painful experiences that it went through, and get your inner child to understand what are adult themes, but and then once your inner child can really confront that and come to terms with it all, you got a very, very brave inner child, then your whole self feels more unified and integrated, and a sense of pride reemerges.
Yeah, that pride. Have a very strong inner child. Yeah. It's like that feeling those things that we dare not feel. And then that gives us the strength.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
exactly. Um, and just to add on that, Torpy, I think
Mm.
later in life, the big issue that I haven't come to terms. Well, you do need good. Life's all about strong relationships with other people,
Mm. Mm.
and because of a background like ours, or certainly mine, it's very difficult to find people in life who. A lot of healing comes from very strong feeling safe in a relationship, and I was a very kind of anxious person growing up, and I married in many ways a wonderful woman, but she was also quite an avoidant person emotionally. So it's a classic anxious person going after an avoidant person, and this clash and everything. So we divorced recently, unfortunately, but it's kind of unavoidable. Well, anyway, another story there. But my point is, often people, if we go through the experiences we've gone through, it's actually very difficult to establish healthy relationships later in life, which further, which further exacerbates the problems. So it's yeah. So it's not easy. Even later in life, midlife is not easy, because if you do marry the wrong person, then the insecurities re-emerge and anxieties re-emerge. But I think the upside of it is, though, by going through all this, you do become more emotionally intelligent and emotionally more resilient, and that can then lead to much greater, healthier relationships going forward.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, I so agree. I think it does. It gives us that resilience. What my coach talks about anti-fragile.
Mm.
The obstacles make us stronger, the Stoics.
Yeah,
And it's like, yeah, I think our traumas can make us into really strong and benevolent humans. So, mm. So
absolutely.
where time-wise, we're starting to wrap this up. Are there any final thoughts, or, we've talked about many different things, tools for recovery, emotional neglect, complex PTSD. What final thoughts would you like to leave with people who've maybe been through boarding school or not had good attachment as children?
I think, from my sense, it's not acknowledging how scary childhood was, which was then exacerbated by boarding school experiences. Because childhood fear is really existential, deep fear, and then the sense of personal shame can be very deep and very profound. So I think the more men like ourselves can really admit to how scared deep down I certainly was and remain, and how insecure I remain, and how part of me still feels like this tiny little meek little child, and how part of me there's still an element of self-hatred there, and the depths that can go to, and also I think it's great that we've both acknowledged, violent thoughts do occur because there's so much repressed anger and rage. I think it's just a question of just acknowledging to yourself, and hopefully to a therapist or a good friend or someone like yourself, Piers, how that the feelings of feeling like excrement or the violent thoughts, you're not alone in having these. Everybody has them. Certainly people have gone through what we've gone through. These are normal feelings. Often you think, well, God, nobody else can feel as bad about myself as I do. Or these violent thoughts I've had of retribution or something must be really weird. Nobody else can be having these. Well, other people do. And I think the more people admit to it, admit to the level of self-disgust and shame and everything, the more you realize you're not on your own. And it's when as soon as you realize you're not on your own, that all the clouds lift and you realize, wow. And then you can talk about it a bit. And then life is so much easier. It's just a question of trying to be brutally honest with yourself and acknowledging those fears, and to other people, because we all crave connection, we all crave attachment. And on the positive point, I think going through traumatic experiences can create much stronger attachment and connection going forward by showing vulnerability. Because when you show vulnerability, other people really connect to that. They don't connect to some guy showing off his Porsche and his latest fat paycheck. You attach or you relate to people who show vulnerability. So I think going through trauma can really forge much greater human connection going forward, which is what we're all looking for.
Thank you. Beautiful words. Beautiful words. We're not on our own. Yeah, so agreed.
That's it. It's exactly that.
Bless you. So how do people find your books? What's the best place of getting in touch with you?
My book's on Amazon. The pseudonym is Luke Pemberton, Pemberton, Pemberton. So I'm on Amazon. That's where my books are available. I have a website which is pretty outdated, info@lukepemberton.com is an email address people can write to me at. I'm also on LinkedIn under both names, actually. Michael Davitt, Davitt is my full name. I'm kind of more going with Michael Davitt now than Luke Pemberton, because I want to own my story rather than use a pseudonym. But those, anyway, Amazon and info@lukepemberton.com. But you can also find me at Michael Davitt on social media.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure, a real honor speaking to you. And thank you for your courage and sharing, and for the journey you've been through and how you're helping others with your books and your talk. So yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you, Piers, for the opportunity. You're the one who offers these opportunities. So I'm so grateful to you. I really, really am.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.